Hello everyone. I will be explaining this on my arm, but later in the talk, just so you all know. So my talk is Our Cyborg Bodies, the Influence of Science on Technology. I'll be starting off talking about my research group, then going through the relationship of science fiction and science with some examples from science fiction and kind of flipping between those and actual science stuff, and then onto my favorite area of brain-computer interfaces before I talk a little bit about myself, because I love that subject. So this is my research group, Aspire Create. This is our photo from the Christmas party, the end of last year. We've actually grown considerably since then. We're growing very, very fast. But CREATE stands for the Center for Rehabilitative Engineering and Assistive Technologies. And we're sort of a group that we take the kind of holistic approach to these sort of disorders, paralysis, amputation, all these kind of things. And we're looking at the kind of whole body issues. And also taking the view of not just as current methods are, where should someone have a surgery where they've lost a limb and then you do rehabilitation, but actually kind of doing a prehabilitation where before someone has a surgery, you kind of get them used to this concept of of losing their limb and having it replaced with something else. So this is my favorite quote to do with this particular bit of it, why the influence of science fiction on technology. So Ursula Le Guin, a very famous science fiction author. Science fiction is not prescriptive, it is descriptive. This is very good at kind of explaining why science fiction and science are so intertwined. Science fiction describes these very futuristic technologies. It goes into the kind of social consequences, the economic consequences, all these kind of things. And then a scientist comes along, looks at it and goes, oh, that device sounds awesome. I reckon I could make it if I do this, this, and this. And lets us be quite creative and gives us very good ideas of what to make. So the science fiction kind of comes up with these new concepts, these new ideas, and we as scientists make them a reality. This is the bit of science fiction that I love the most, the video game Deus Ex. Now, I don't know how many of you in here can say that you know exactly the thing that makes you do what you do now, why you are where you are. But this game that was released in 2000, which I probably played around 2001, when I would have been about 13 years old, this game is exactly why I'm doing the research I do now, why I'm standing here in front of you. It is entirely this video game. So that tells you something of the influence science fiction can have on science and on scientists. So the thing I love about this game, or one of the many things, is it's all about human augmentation. I mean, there's also a lot of conspiracy stuff in the game, but it's all about these enhancements, prosthesis and stuff. And one of the things I very much like about it is in the game you have a lot of these people who are shown here, who are kind of have classical prosthesis, classical augmentations, very visible physical devices that you see on them that give them enhanced abilities, but also, restore function if they have taken damage. And your character is actually on this kind of verge of this nanotechnological revolution where these augmentations are no longer visible, and you are starting to have much more in-depth enhancements. I quite like this idea of the threshold where things are changing quite considerably from one thing to another. And in fact, the most recent game that came out, Deus Ex Human Revolution, is concerned more with the transition from how we are now, with people walking around perfectly normally. Some people have prosthetics, but very few people have these very nice, very good enhancements, very good prosthetics, and it's starting to change into this thing. And an element of this I really like is the idea that the prosthesis aren't designed for people who have disabilities, they're designed for everyone. So people can be augmented, and it's this nice kind of step change from the idea of, oh, we do this to help someone who's has suffered an injury or has been disabled, and to it's just for everyone. And it changes the whole design parameters. But as you see here, these are very quite aesthetically pleasing prosthesis, and these are probably not what you expect when you think of a prosthesis. You're probably thinking more of these things. Here we have a Victorian era prosthesis on the left, and a modern prosthesis by Otterbock on the right. But what you can see here is actually the aesthetics at play. A modern prosthesis like this is kind of pretending to be a human hand. It's kind of pink, it's rubbery. the people who have them don't really like it that much because it's pretending to be a hand and doesn't really look like it. And that kind of causes a bit of a dissonance, whereas if you have something that isn't pretending to be something, it is obviously something else, you get a much better aesthetic to it. And actually, I much prefer the look of the Victorian prosthesis to the modern prosthesis. I think that looks much cooler. But we are actually on the cusp of this change where prosthesis are starting to move towards more of a fashion accessory thing. As glasses changed in the last 30 years from a medical device to a fashion accessory, so too is it starting to happen with prosthesis. So here we have company Bespoke Innovations making a very nice prosthesis that is designed to suit the person's lifestyle, their clothing choices, all these kind of things to give them a very nice aesthetic choice. This is another design that someone's proposed. Beautiful design, perfectly functional, but makes it very apparent there's a missing limb. Not trying to hide the fact this is gone, but actually just to play with it and to give a very nice visual effect. This is Victoria Modesta, a singer. She actually has a lot of prosthetic legs, all of which for different purposes, for different clothing, for different things. Very, very beautiful. But, so that's prosthesis. A very big thing in science fiction is cyborgs, of course. This is the most famous cyborg of all time, although not famous for being a cyborg. Darth Vader's suit is a life support system. His arms and legs have all been amputated, and he is fully prosthetic, fully cybernetic, and he would be dead without that suit. So he really is the most famous cyborg there is, but not necessarily for being a cyborg. And then you get the kind of transition to other people who are more famous for being cyborgs, like Robocop, very classic bit of science fiction. Again, entirely requires these things to keep him alive, to keep him going, but it's a bit darker in its themes with the people who built him and helped him kind of using devices to control him and not really have him be human, which is one of the things I like about science fiction, looking at the darker elements of stuff. And then the most famous things for being cyborgs really have to be the Borg from Star Trek. And this is kind of your worst case scenario of what you could do with this technology, which is what I quite like. This is a thing that science fiction deals with, is not just, oh, look at these cool devices, but what can be done with these, what can be the consequences of these. But so far the prostheses I showed you were what you might call dumb prosthesis. They're standard prosthesis, there's no real intelligence to them. But neuroprosthesis, such as shown here, these are again from the most recent Deus Ex game from their website it's a fake website for selling these kind of technologies. These are more smart prosthesis, or neuroprosthesis as we call them, which actually integrate with the nervous system. So what do these look like in real life at the moment? Well, this is a good example of a neuroprosthesis as it stands now. This is someone who's completely lost their arm. Here you have EMG sensors. These are electromyography sensors. They pick up the electrical activity given off by muscle activation and are used to control the replacement limb. These are quite good, and one of the things people do to make them better is you can actually take the nerves that were previously going to the limb that you've lost and rewire them to the muscles that you still have. So you can get quite accurate control that to your brain is similar to how you controlled your original arm because you're using the same nerves. Here we have another example of an EMG thing. This is Grace Mandeville, a CBBC presenter, wearing an Open Bionics arm. This is EMG powered again, so the muscle activity allows her to control the different functions. I quite like this picture for one simple reason. Open Bionics project is about making very, very cheap prosthesis. These can be 3D printed by anyone for dirt cheap. Well, I say dirt cheap, £500. And the whole ethos is making these kind of things available for everyone. The reason why I like this picture so much is that they've got one of the cheapest prostheses possible to produce and covered it in Swarovski crystals, making it quite expensive. But what does EMG look like? Because I'm sure most of you will have never seen it. Well, my arm. This is an EMG device that I'm wearing now that I built last week. Here are the electrodes that are on my hand, and they pick up the motor activity when I lift my finger. If you put your hand on your muscle here, you'll feel that it tenses when you raise that finger, but doesn't pretty much tense when you do any other movement, making it very good for controlling a presentation like this. The EMG signals from that go into this little red bit, which translates that into something that the blue bit, an Arduino, can understand. I then have a program running on that to look for it to go over certain thresholds, and I have a bit on my wrist that lets me control the presentation if things go wrong, and a Bluetooth device that tricks my computer into thinking that I'm using a keyboard right now. And so when I turn it back on, because I deactivated the EMG part for that little demonstration, when I raise my finger, it'll change slide. So this. So how else can you control a device like this? Well, this is a nerve cuff. It's a bit of silicon with platinum or stainless steel in it that you wrap around a nerve, and it can pick up the actual activity from a nerve itself, letting you have pretty real functionality. You send the same signal to control your arm as you normally would, and then it lets you control the prosthesis. But what about feedback? In The Empire Strikes Back, Luke Skywalker is given a prosthetic hand, and when he's spiked by a robot, you can see him twitching in response, feeling pain. Well, there are different ways of doing this. One of those is by incorporating the nerve cuff to feed in a signal as well as take it out. This image here is one that my supervisor quite likes to say as being something that's fiction within science. This is the ideal goal of the project that's been done. It's got all the kind of different parts, but then the power is magically coming from nowhere, and the information is being magically transmitted by nowhere. This device is developed by DARPA in one of their projects, is ridiculously impressive. Someone equipped with this can actually go rock climbing, and they feel their hold on the rocks and stuff, and it's really good. But they are absolutely covered in wirings. They have a back thing covered in batteries. It looks nothing like this. But it does work how they want it to work. So it's a bit of a mixture of fiction in representing science. How else can you do feedback? Well, something like this is, it's an invasive surgery, it's quite expensive. A cheap way of doing it is vibrotactile stimulation. This is a project one of our students was doing very recently, where you use a motor to vibrate, giving the information to a part of you where you still have, where your skin still has sensation, to give you the information that you can't otherwise have. So this was being used to give surface roughness. So you, rather than stroking your hand on a surface to feel how rough it is, you have a vibration on your arm telling you how rough the surface is. It works quite well, and it's a nice way of doing it that's quite cheap. But what about when you still have your limbs, but you can't control them? Well, paralysis is a well-known disorder. This is the most famous paralyzed person in sci-fi, Professor Xavier from the X-Men. As well as having paralysis and having his magical floaty wheelchair thing, he also has telepathy and telekinesis and things like this. So what about if we wanted to control something with telekinesis? This is Tom, my second supervisor, sitting in the front, controlling a wheelchair with his mind. If he imagine clenches his right hand, the wheelchair turns right. If he imagine clenches his left hand, the wheelchair turns left. If you imagine clenches both, the wheelchair moves forwards. It's a cool way of controlling things, and you do so with your mind. But what about when you want to control stuff that you already have in paralysis? For example, the muscles that you have, you can only get signals to them. How can you control them otherwise? Well, FES is one way of doing this, where you put electrodes on someone, you pass a current through, and it stimulates the muscle, allowing you to control it. And my supervisor will have this attached to her later, and you can press a button and make her arm move and make her leg move. It's very fun and impressive. Not so much for her. What is the purpose of this? Well, at the moment it's not at the point where you can make someone walk or do anything like this, but they can exercise. So this is Robin, who works with us, who uses it for rowing. So it lets someone who has paralysis row, giving them exercise, working the muscles that would otherwise waste away. It prevents, muscle wastage, which has its own problems, but also gives good cardiac exercise and other things which someone who has paralysis cannot get and as such, their health will suffer a sort of decline. What else can you do with technology? Well, play games. This is some sort of rugby-like thing in trikes. All these people are paralyzed, and the FES is being used to pedal, so they're actually moving under their own power, but it's FES that's triggering their muscles to activate. Also, it gives you a bit more freedom if you are paralyzed. You can go in the great outdoors and take your trike down a road like you would with a bicycle and get a much better view of things and have some freedom that you otherwise have lost. Another big thing in sci-fi is exoskeletons. Have the very famous power loader from Aliens on the left, and less famous Elysium on the right. This is actually much more like the exoskeletons that you see nowadays, and it was kind of based on them. A lot of research for that is being done for military applications so people can carry heavier things. What does that look like in the real world? Well, on the left we have HAL by Cyberdyne, very sci-fi names, which allows a perfectly healthy individual to carry heavy loads. On the right we have Rewalk. This allows someone with paralysis to actually walk. The main issue with this is it's not good for everyone, because you need to still be able to control your trunk muscles in order to balance yourself and support yourself on the crutches. So if you have a higher level paralysis, this is not actually that useful. But if you do have that higher level of paralysis, there are devices such as the Rex, which supports you, including the trunk, holding you up. And this allows you to do things like rehabilitation while standing, or things that aren't as useful physically, but have a much higher emotional impact, like standing up to give the speech at your daughter's wedding. This is Irving, who is one of the main advisors for our research group, giving the father's speech at his daughter's wedding. And things like that, it's not necessarily that great to move in. It's quite a slow, bulky device, very loud, but it lets you stand up, which in a lot of cases is the important thing. You just want to be able to stand for things like this. But now onto my favorite topic. This is brain-computer interfaces. There's a brain again from Deus Ex with a brain-computer interface. This particular one from the game is for computer-assisted social interaction enhancer. Tells you the emotions of the people around you so you can better manipulate them. Video game. I've been interested in this ever since I saw a documentary when I was 15 years old on this particular piece of research here. Learning to control a brain-machine interface for reaching and grasping by primates. In this particular piece of research, they got some monkeys, they put electrodes directly into their brain, and then they had them perform a task. This task was to move a joystick, to move a circle on a screen, and then apply pressure to the joystick to change the size of the circle. When the circle was in the right spot and the right size, this gave the monkey a treat. The thing that was most fascinating about this research, well, I need to play a bit more first, sorry. They had a computer looking at the output from the nerves, and they had it looking at what the joystick was doing. And after a certain amount of time, the software was able to say, these neural signals mean this response on the joystick. At that point, they turn off the joystick, allowing the monkey to just control the joystick and the task with its brain. The thing that is really fascinating about this research is that one of the monkeys actually realized that the joystick it was using was no longer functional, and it was in fact controlling the task with its brain. So it stopped using the joystick and just sat there and did the task by thinking about it. This is insanely impressive, and this is why I love this sort of area. So how do we pick up signals from the brain? Well, here you've got a standard brain. All your brains should have this order to it. There is a slight difference from person to person, but nothing major from these pictures. So the primary motor cortex, the purple bit there, is where kind of, if you're planning to make a motor movement, it's done in the front part of that, and then when you execute the movement, it shifts to the rear part of the purple bit. And that's, so we know whereabouts we're looking, but then how do we know what we're seeing in the bit we're looking at? Well, on the right we have what's called the homunculus, which represents which part of the body is which part of the brain. And so for the hands, for example, it's just here. So that bit there is my left hand, and that bit there is my right hand. And so by knowing this, you can actually control the device by picking up the signals from the correct area. what does this kind of thing look like? Well, this is an EEG cap. This is me doing a little study we were doing a month or so ago. And that picks up the signals from my brain, or the brain waves, the same way of saying it. But so this is EEG, electroencephalography, and this is the signals you get from it. The top left, you get a nice clean reading. That's what you get if you put that cap on me. That's the electrical signals being put out by my brain. There are some issues with this, in that a lot of things can introduce noise to the signal that kind of wipe it out. So when you were looking at that, you would not be able to see in that signal me doing stuff like clenching my right hand, clenching my left hand. A computer would be able to analyze it and pick it out quite clearly, but a human eye couldn't. But then, to show kind of examples of where noise comes in, this one here is me blinking rapidly. The muscles in my eyelids are producing a much larger signal, or at least where the electrodes are reading a much larger signal than the actual neurons in my brain. On the bottom left, that's me looking from left to right, and here is me clenching my teeth. As you can see, these kind of things completely drown out EEG, which slightly reduces its usefulness in a real-world scenario when you actually are moving around and not just completely stationary imagining things. One way to beat this is to get closer to the brain. So this method here is ECOG, electrocardiography, where you're actually taking the signals from the surface of the brain. This is done for a short-term basis, usually while looking for focal sites of things like epilepsy before surgery to remove them. And if you thought that was gory, I'm going to show a slide what it really looks like. So this is what it really looks like. That's someone's brain with the ECOG mesh on it. So that would be in for place for about 2 weeks. You get very good signals from it, but no kind of long-term studies have been done on how useful this is as a control system, because, as I said, it's only for kind of looking for things like epilepsy in the focal region of that. Another method of doing it, this is the method that was used in the study that I was talking about earlier with the monkeys, is depth electrodes. This is when you get sharp little electrodes and you place them directly into the brain tissue themselves, penetrating in. This is excellent because it gives you very lovely signals from just a handful of neurons around the site where your things are, where you've got your little recording sites. But on the other hand, has major disadvantages in the fact you are actually putting someone in someone's brain, you're breaking the blood-brain barrier, increased risk of infection, rejection, scarring, all sorts of things that make it not so great. However, this is it in use. And so this tiny little bit here is the actual kind of depth electrodes going to the person's brain. You've got a wire going up to the skull, then they have this big device screwed on top of their skull. It gives beautiful signals, but it's really not that great risk-wise. And on the right here we have a woman who has had this implanted. She has very high level paralysis, and she is able to control a robotic arm to pick up this bottle of water and drink it herself. So she has proper control of the arm, can move it quite nicely, can grip with it, can release with it. As nice as the system is, the main disadvantage of it is it's only really good in a lab scenario like this where you have the robotic arm. Because almost no one has one of these devices, there's no real kind of mass market or anything that really relies on this kind of thing. So it's a cool research thing, but its invasiveness is way too high to be widespread, and therefore its usefulness is reduced because if no one has it, no one's going to build anything that takes advantage of it. This brings me on to my project. So in my project, I'm trying to design a minimally invasive brain-computer interface is what we're calling it. So a way of getting around the issues with the invasive ones, where they have the chance of infection, rejection, scarring, and all this, but at the same time increasing the signal quality beyond that of EEG. So for that, I have been designing phantoms. These are kind of mock models to test the electrical scenario and the mechanical scenario of possible devices to get around this. And to do that, I have been to make these phantoms, I had an MRI. This is my brain. That's my brain. The little bits on it that aren't quite brain-looking are bits of dura, which is the sac that your brain sits in, and blood vessels that I couldn't quite eliminate from this particular view. But how do I turn that into a real thing? Well, if Star Trek taught us anything, I asked the replicators to make it. In this case, I didn't ask the replicator, I asked the Ultimaker, which is my nice fancy 3D printer. So this is my brain, quite literally. 3D printed, made real. So I'm going to pass this around. You can all take a look at my brain and see my brain. It should be 1:1 scale. It probably is. Maybe a little bit off, but that is my brain. So I'll just pass that around. So this brings me on to a bit of this of who am I? How did I get into all this? Well, as a little kid, I was quite creative. I loved making things and I loved taking them apart. I always wanted to be an inventor, and as a very young child, probably around the age of 4, this was my idol. Albert the Fifth Musketeer. He's smart, he's cool, he's nobody's fool, he's Albert the Fifth Musketeer. It was the traditional Musketeer story, but they added an extra character who got everyone out of trouble by inventing little devices and things to well, get everyone out of trouble. Lots of little inventions, and this is what I wanted to be. But also, we had I had this joy of understanding how things work. I took everything apart, and this was very useful for me as a kid, the way things work. It was a book, but it also had a CD in it, which had animated videos of how things work, taken apart. Explained by woolly mammoths for some reason, but fantastic. If you have any kids or know any kids who like this kind of thing, they are releasing a new version of this later this year with updated animations and things. So totally get that. I think it was awesome. So I kind of was exposed to all these things, and the way I became a scientist really was, it was a desire to understand how things worked, coupled with this inventiveness, which is why I'm doing a kind of creative project, making a new solution to a problem. And to be honest, I don't think there's anything special that made me a scientist or anything, beyond the fact I just want to know how things work and I want to make things. And I think that's all you really need. But I'll go into some things that are great for inspiration in this particular subject. So here's some books to read, if you like that stuff. Alistair Reynolds, currently my favorite author, great sci-fi author. None of his books are about the topics I've talked about, but he kind of has an assumption in all his work. They're all set in the future. In all his work, he just assumes this sort of technology will exist. People will have augmentations, and it will be standard, and everyone will have it. And so the things he describes are amazing, and the kind of the impact they have on society and how they change things are amazing. But they're just kind of like an afterthought in his work, which is brilliant. And it's a great place to look if you want to kind of be inspired by what this kind of thing could consist of. Films. Ghost in the Shell, released in 1995, based on a manga, a Japanese manga that was released in 1989, goes very heavily into the area of cybernetics, as well as kind of what it means to be human, and a heavy amount of it is kind of set in the internet and around the internet, and that was written in 1989, before the internet was really a thing. So this kind of gives you an idea of how kind of ahead of its time and revolutionary it was. Even now, it's kind of cutting edge, which is quite amazing. A TV thing to look at for great things on this is Almost Human. This show was cancelled after about 8 episodes. It's not that great, but the technology in it is fantastic. Really, really good futuristic technology, cybernetics, prosthesis, all these kind of things. Worth a watch if you're interested in that, just to see the stuff they come up with. It's really good. And of course, for games, Deus Ex and Deus Ex Human Revolution. Deus Ex, 16 years old game, is still sold for $10 on the cheapest website you can find it, because of how highly regarded it is that it's still great. If you want to play a game to have a look at these things, I'd recommend Human Revolution over Deus Ex, even though I think Deus Ex is the best game ever made, because its mechanics are quite old, and you kind of have to get around that in order to enjoy it properly. But I'll just leave you with my 2 favorite coupled quotes when it comes to this stuff. Arthur C. Clarke's famous quote, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic," and Terry Pratchett's quote of one of his characters, quote, that was a response to that, "Any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from technology." So If you make something that looks like magic, you're a really, really great inventor or scientist. If you make something that looks like technology, you're obviously a wizard. So to leave you off, any questions?